Welcome to episode 20 of the Leadership Podcast, where our disagreements inform your decisions. I'm the resident libertarian, Dion Dixon, and I'm joined today by Republican Brett Miller and Democrats Thea Ali and Will Atkins. Today, we're going to be discussing states' rights versus the power of the federal government. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss one of our disagreements. And to start us off, I think I'm going to kick it over to Will.
I disagree. Any discussion about states' rights is really just code for slavery, right?
Oh, man. You're just going to jump right into it, huh?
Bring it. All right. So back in the day, right? We'll start with the Bill of Rights. Deanna, I liked your 10th Amendment, which basically says anything that is not written down in the Constitution as being the power of the federal government is given to the states, right? It's the non-enumerated powers or the people. Fine, yes. And then what we've seen, essentially Federalists versus Anti-Federalists back in the day, in order to get Anti-Federalists on board, it was seen as kind of a compromise, right? That even though some of the drafters of the Constitution felt like, if it wasn't written in the Constitution, then that power does not belong to the federal government, but it was seen as a compromise to say, okay, fine, we'll also write it in the 10th Amendment that explicitly says if we didn't write it down, it's reserved to the states or the people. And that was seen as a compromise just to make sure that we could get the Constitution ratified and then move on from there. And what we've seen then is over time, how much power the federal government has. There's a lot of Supreme Court cases that I'm sure that we'll get to, but in my mind, the big thing that jumps out is slavery. That southern states wanted the right to continue having slavery, and if you extrapolate that, in my opinion, most of what we've seen, in terms of the negative side to states' rights is that you never hear about a state that's like, I want to give more rights to my people than the federal government does. It's very seldom, I'll say. Marijuana might be one of the few that I do see, but in general, it seems to me like it's always a state that wants to discriminate, limit the rights of the people in their own state. They don't like how much power, what rights the federal government is providing, and they want to limit it in some way. So things like whether that's slavery or being against desegregation or abortion, or you could go on and on. It seems like whenever someone says states' rights, it's because they want to limit power.
So I'm going to jump in because it's ironic. As someone who currently lives in California, I'll push back on that because I feel like in the recent era, in the post-Dobbs world, and with a lot of things that are going on with the current administration, California is now becoming a state that definitely is wanting to assert their rights, and it's the rights to still be able to codify certain things that it looks like the administration, isn't in favor of. So, like, for example, the whole, being able to still legally get an abortion in this state, that's something that's been big for California. Another thing, as an employment attorney, the rights of the employee in the state of California are far beyond that of the rights of an employee in any other state. Maybe Massachusetts and New York come close in certain areas, but for the most part, what will always keep me in business is California has so many more rights for employees. So it's interesting. I've always kind of been like you, Will. When I hear states' rights, I've always felt like that's the right to not have to provide certain things to people. But I think right now in California, we are seeing that. Also, our environmental laws are another big one, right? Like there's a lot of environmental regulations that exist in California that a lot of, that the federal government, or at least the current administration, is against. So it is interesting. It can cut both ways depending on the state that you live in and their values.
And I would argue, though, that the only reason the states are doing that right now, okay, Roe v. Wade, everybody had access to abortion. It was, California doesn't want to be codifying a state-only law. They're just having to because the federal government, because of Dobbs, and whether it's environmental or it's coming out now because of, in my opinion, the Trump administration. But 10 years ago, they didn't.
I just think it's interesting, though, because I think the same argument for red states, is the free from the intrusion of the federal government is what red states would say when they are passing certain, laws that, from my perspective, I'd be like, I don't, I don't approve of that, or it's not something I'm in favor of. And I think that the same argument is that, well, this is, we don't agree from our state that this is what we want. And because this isn't something that's enumerated to the federal government, this is something that we are going to pass a particular law, and this is what we want to do based on what's, the prerogative of our citizens within our state. I think that's very much what's happening in California. So it's funny because now I'm in the position where I'm like, I'm glad my state is, going against the grain or protecting certain rights or pushing certain agendas based on the values of the folks in California. But I don't always love it when I see it coming out of another state. And so, I guess that's where it's like, states' rights, is it? Because, okay, obviously the slavery, right? The slavery issue. It's not a surprise. I don't think that any state in the union ever should, I didn't think that was about states' rights, right? The idea is you still had a baseline of humanity that, to allow any state in the union to continue that practice was antithetical to the republic. But today, I think I do agree with the right of California to say if we want to, allow our citizens to have these rights, they should. But the flip side is, like, California has strict gun laws. Texas has very lenient gun laws. And I'm not a huge fan of Texas gun laws, but at the end of the day, that's why I don't live in Texas, right? I'm just picking on Texas because none of us are from there.
I feel like that is a little bit of the beauty of living in the United States. I know that not everybody is in an economic position to necessarily choose where they live, but it does at least give you, for instance, Thea, you are much more comfortable with California's gun laws than, say, Texas or even Virginia, where I live, right? Whereas I would be very uncomfortable with the restrictions on me in California. And I would much prefer to live here in Virginia, at least for the time being, with the gun laws that we have. But I could definitely see where somebody maybe living in Alabama might be very uncomfortable with the abortion access restrictions that they have right now and would much prefer to live in New York or Massachusetts or California. But there is the fact that if you have the means, you can freely move about our country and you can go to places where certain things are more accessible than others. And I think that is probably one of the balances that was intended by this sort of framing of 50 individual states that are bound by a federal government.
And I think the question becomes, though, do we have a baseline where there's certain things that we're saying every citizen of the United States should be entitled to X, Y, and Z, right? Marriage, I think, is a good example. This idea that, you can't have, in one state, it was, so when we were talking about gay marriage, or even before when we were talking, before the Loving decision, interracial marriage, where someone could get married in Virginia and then their marriage is not recognized when they cross state lines. So there are certain things where, even though it's not expressly discussed in the Constitution, that we have had to, I mean, I guess we end up having to come out with different laws and stuff like that, but where you do kind of look at it and say, even though one state, has they've decided that this is how this state wants to assert their rights, it infringes on the rights of individual citizens. And are those rights that we've said are fundamental to every citizen of our country?
Dion, if you extrapolate that to its conclusion, does that not lead to red states and blue states and then the splitting of the United States?
I mean, yes, it's entirely possible. And I think that there is always going to be the looming danger of another civil war. And it is and I think that would exist regardless of what kind of government we had, right? If you look across the United States, we are one of the most diverse populations on the planet when you consider not just racial but also cultural backgrounds that everybody has and they have brought with them to this country. And that is a difficult social experiment to keep running peacefully. The fact that we've done it for 250 years with only one civil war is actually quite astonishing when you look at the rest of the countries around the world and how often even Western countries, how often they internally conflict with each other. The history of mankind actually shows that we are in an anomaly, not the norm. So, yes, and I think, as we've previously discussed with our podcast about the media and how it influences people and everything, we very much are in a sort of a red America and a blue America right now. I think some of that is good. Some of that sort of friction, I think, helps to sort of pull apart some of these difficult decisions that we as a country have to make. As you mentioned, slavery, right? We had to at some point make a decision: are we going to be a country of slaves and slavers, or are we going to be a country of free people? And it was a messy decision that we had to make, but we made it, and we became a nation of free people. There will probably be other decisions like that. Hopefully, we can solve them before it comes to open war. But I think abortion is probably one of the next ones. Gun control will probably come up there. I'm trying to think of, probably LGBTQ rights. Those are probably some that are really friction points now.
But they weren't 10 years ago. They weren't nearly, I shouldn't say that. They were friction points, but they weren't nearly as frictionable as now.
So why would that be? Do you think it's because certain people who occupy political positions have sort of made them into flashpoint topics? Or do you think it's because as certain things have become more acceptable across greater swaths of society, they have become more visible to people who would rather not see them?
I think that we have too much of an all or nothing style of politics, and where we have this zero sum game situation where people feel like if it's not absolutely everything that they want in politics, then it can't exist, and there's not enough room to accept that you and I, Dion, can live in the same place and do it in a harmonious way and figure out ways that where you're not going to get everything. Like, I guess I'm very pragmatic when it comes to like looking at the government and certain things. And so this idea that everybody's going to get everything they want every time, all the time, that's not, government can't work that way, because it's not going to, every person doesn't want the same thing. And there's multiple groups and there's different stakeholders. But I think our politics has gotten to the point where it feels like, neither side will, come and genuinely compromise on certain things, or not even neither side, but I think both sides have issues where they are uncompromising on those specific issues. And that has made it so that it's difficult to get anything done. And so, I struggle with it. And I think also the demonization of the other side, right? And I think that's right now where we are seeing it it's just really hard to listen to, or to see the way that any type of criticism, like I was even thinking, like, should I be doing this podcast anymore as a Democrat? Right. I work at a big law firm, and right now you see the law firms are in the crosshairs of the administration. And there's definitely a desire for us, as lawyers, we don't want to be the center of attention, right? We're there to represent our clients. We want our clients to be able to come to us without any fear that our representation of them is going to put them in the crosshairs of the administration. And, it's hard right now to even say, like, for me to be like, well, is it the fact that I'm a known Democrat now because I'm doing this public podcast, is that going to be something that could somehow come back negatively on my firm? So kind of coming back to what you said, like, what's changed? I just think we've allowed our politics to be too zero sum, too all or nothing. And that's where red states and blue states, we've like really, I don't remember growing up knowing that term. Like, I don't think I understood what that was. And now I know my 7-year-old, funny story, a hard copy newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, flew over the fence of their playground this week. And it was like the editorial page. And my 7-year-old second grade son is reading it with his friends, the Wall Street Journal, like the actual newspaper, and comes home and asks me, Mom, do I think Trump has gone too far? And I was like, what? Why is this? Like, what is this on your mind? Right. And he brought home the newspaper to show me what they were reading. And I could believe they actually read it and thought to talk about it. But as he was talking about it, it was very clear that he was aware of, like, oh, well, we live in California, we'll be okay. And I was like, what? Why do you know that? Like, why do you understand that because we live in a particular state, somehow you think we're not going to be as impacted as other people would be by what he views as like the negative aspects of the Trump administration? And what does he know of that at 7 years old? But I think that's just, it illustrates kind of where we are and the polarization and how deep it goes, how far down it goes even to our kids.
Well, I think it's kind of the point, Thea, right? Because, I mean, we're talking through that, and the point of the discussion is federal versus state rights, right? And it seems to the point where you're talking about a one-size-fits-all approach is not the right idea. And that's what a federal top-down government would be, is it's that one-size-all solution. And it's a terrible idea. With the type of government that we have, it doesn't work effectively. And again, we've got 50 states. And with that is kind of 50 separate experiments of how government can work. I mean, yes, we have a unifying factor that we're all part of the same country, but we're actually supposed to try things out a little bit differently and see how they go. Now, I'm with you guys. I don't think that applies to human rights issues, right? You guys have known me from what I've talked about with this. I'm always about people first, when it comes to the individual and, respecting that aspect of things. Government should be small. It's one of the points that we were kind of making when we had, starting our chat before we all kind of came into the official podcast, was that, government should be so small and so efficient that you really don't think about it, that it's not even kind of there. It's just in the background and it works effectively. But we've got to the point where we have these big issues that, they are the friction points. It's the passion points that should kind of strike people as necessary to have. And when they keep getting pushed into the national spotlight where the federal government is going to make a decision on it, that's where we're having all these big issues. Whereas if states had more choices in these things, I think to Dion's point, we would see people make the choice, and they would kind of, just like they do with their products when they buy stuff for their house in some regards, that they vote with their dollars. Well, it would be the same thing. People would vote with their dollars in terms of where they live. And yes, I recognize that not everybody has the economic ability to move and do that. But I will say you have the economic opportunity, right? It might take you 5 to 10 years to figure out how to do it, but it can be done. But anyway.
I think the pushback on that, though, is for the person. So let's say the trans person living in Alabama. that 5 to 10 years could be life or death to them based on their ability to live their life out in the open as who they are, right? So I think that's where it's hard sometimes. I think where our privilege comes into play, where I think all of us are in a position where we can choose where we live, and I think we've chosen where we want to live. And I do know for not, like you said, even though eventually someone could probably make that move, the time and the effort that it would take, that in that interim, that person feels like they're now being made to suffer because the particular state that they're in may not provide for their rights in the way that they think all citizens should have those rights. Because I think really where we see the tension with states' rights is where a particular state has a law or a particular policy in place that the minority in that state feel infringe on their I guess you could call it super rights or inalienable rights, right? And that's where we start to see the tension, where someone's like, it shouldn't matter that I live in X state. I should still be able to do this or be free from X, and that's where it's kind of, I think that's where we start to see the tension.
And that's the whole. Yeah. That's the whole point of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. Yeah. The fact that just because you live in Alabama doesn't mean that you're that your rights don't apply to you in one state versus another. Anywhere that you live,
And we haven't gotten into these topics yet, and we it's definitely on our list of topics to cover, but abortion and LGBTQ policies are on our list of topics that we should discuss. But I just want to bring up that I think the reason why those topics are coming up as we're discussing different states and their different approaches is because there's a lot of gray area there right now at the national policy level as to which group of people are being affected by what. So let's take, for instance, the abortion discussion, right? Which we're not going to get into the abortion discussion now, but basically one side says that is a human being, that is a life that you are terminating against that human being's will, and the other side says this is my body, and I have the right to do with my body as I choose, right? So on one side, it's the right of the mother. On the other side, people are saying it's the right of the unborn. And I think until we have some sort of decision, my personal opinion is that we as a nation have to define when personhood starts. And then I think that discussion kind of then just naturally falls out, because if you say this is a person, then natural laws apply as to what you can and cannot do to another person. So, and then the same thing with LGBTQ issues is that, typically it's trans women in women's spaces. That's where the friction points usually come up. And it's the balance of the rights of the women in those closed spaces versus the rights of the people who identify as women and believe that they should have those same rights. And so it's that conflict that we haven't clearly defined what is what, and it's that squishy gray area that makes it so that one state can decide one thing and another state can decide another thing, and that's where we are.
Well, actually, for the trans issue, I would say it's similar to how you framed the abortion issue as far as identifying when how we define personhood. I think it's really just how we define gender, because for the trans woman who's a woman, they will say I'm a woman. They won't say that that their identity is in conflict with that of someone like myself, a cis woman, right? And so it's how we define gender in itself. And then you have people who are non-binary and all these other things, and where do they fit into the puzzle? And like you're saying, because there's not clear definitions, or there's no agreement on how those things are defined, and as a nation as a whole, we haven't come to an agreement. That's where you see these frictions, because then as people are traveling across borders in the state, from state to state, their rights change based on where they are, and that's ideally, I don't think that's what the intent was under the founding fathers framework, that when you travel from California to Texas, suddenly your rights completely change, right? And I think you're right. think, I don't remember who said it already. We've had to, I think, Dion, you hinted this. We've had to have these conversations before, beyond just figuring out whether we were going to be a free country or a country that had slaves. Through the civil rights movement, we had to figure out whether I was going to be able to go to Georgia and stay in a hotel and eat at a public restaurant. And did I have those rights? And that was a battle that in my parents' lifetime, they saw fought. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even that far in the past. So I think we are. So I guess I'm pushing back on our premise that we said a little while ago that things have changed. I don't know if it's changed. I think it's just different topics that are putting us at odds and having to have these discussions. Whereas 50 years ago, we were having these fights. It was just over. There were different groups of people that were fighting for their right or for their seat at the table.
Yeah, Thea, to your earlier point, you had said when that you didn't remember knowing the difference between red and blue states as a kid, and then your 7-year-old is reading, Wall Street Journal. I was going to bring up that, I bet a 7-year-old trying to go to school in Little Rock in the 60s knew the difference between different states at that time. And then just there's this, but I do think it like ebbs and flows, because I don't think, we had like school busing in the 70s and 80s, but like, I don't know, I feel like there was this time period where there wasn't as much in conflict, that we'd all kind of, I don't know, I feel like we kind of settled it out for a little while.
Because that's a good point. Like when we were kids, we were kids in the 80s. It was the Reagan era, and Clinton, in the early 90s, and I'm Bush and Clinton. I'm trying to think, why was I not? I don't remember having this sense of like everything is falling apart above my head the way that my son clearly does at a very young age. Not falling apart, but that he's very aware that there is a conflict and there's disagreement, and that, we are kind of at a boiling point. He's aware of that. And I wasn't, at his age.
Is it this?
He doesn't have a phone.
Is it the fact that like we have just constant, we have constant access to like all the information all across the globe. True. And, there's that old saying that if it bleeds, it reads, right? So like it's that nobody wants to read about how wonderful everything is going in, 90% of the world today. Yeah. The things that people read about are the 10% of god awful horror going on everywhere.
Actually, Dion, I think you hit the nail on the head, but actually I'll take it a step further. I don't even think it's the phones. When we were kids, cable was just now becoming a thing. So CNN wasn't even a thing when I was little, right? When we were little. And so I think the idea of it was easier to live in your bubble in your state because you weren't as plugged into what was going on in other states, because you didn't have access to it, between there not being the internet like we know it today, and you really weren't watching national news the way we watch national news, even if you are watching news. But, I grew up in California, and I lived in an area where everyone walked to school. So there was no busing, because like California, if you know like how densely populated it is, like 1 mile radius, there's your school, and I don't know, I was oblivious to a lot of things. And it wasn't until I got to high school and I moved to South Carolina that I was like, oh, this is very different than California was, and so, yeah, I think you're right. Like we lived more in a bubble, so it was easier. Your state, like, Brett always talks about your community and things being local. I think when we were younger, it was easier to live and be plugged and really only be have awareness of your local community. And unless something was really, really big and hit the national news and you would see it, on the ABC, CBS, or NBC, like you just weren't going to be paying attention to it like we are now.
Well, I think that's a good point, right? The whole 24-hour news cycle, to where everything all the time, there's always information, there's always something being reported, and it doesn't even have to be local to you, but there's something being said out there. Whereas, Thea, like you said, it really only got to the big stage when we were kids, when it was big enough to be national news. Yes. And so, you had to be more involved in your communities. And, you pointed out, I've talked about that several times before, that we've separated ourselves from each other and we don't have that community aspect. And I know we're probably drifting off topic a little bit, considering we're haven't really touched on like the advantages of states' rights or the advantages of federal powers. But I mean, I think that's a very good point, is that we probably are inundated with information, and we've got to the point where people say we're in an information age. I don't know as we are anymore. Information's accessible. I think we need to shift more into a wisdom age in terms of what we actually do with the information. And I don't think a lot of people think about what to do with the information. They just hear it and repeat it. And I think that's a part of why we've gotten into such divisive politics, is that people don't actually take the time to think things through and talk about it, a lot like what we're doing here. People just get their narrative and they push on with their day.
Yeah, and Dion brought that up earlier about how, some of the conflict that we're seeing today is perhaps because things are much more in your face than they used to be.
Yeah.
That, when gay marriage was first legalized, and I think it was 2015, it wasn't as in your face as as it has become more and more accepted. It's being seen more and more, and then that's what's causing the conflict.
Well, it's also what gets magnified. And I guess I do think this is still on topic, because I think we skipped ahead of just even framing the premise of when we talk about states' rights. It's the concept, like, we said, do you want a stronger, or I guess it's a tension between having a strong unified federal government, right, that is establishing like a baseline of laws and rights across the country, and then still the states having the rights to have autonomy over their own citizenry, right? And inherently there's tension there. So I think our discussion is kind of jumped to what the tension is, how we got here, and then, kind of the feeling of, well, what do we do about it? Is there any, what do we do about it? Do we think that the system we have is the system we want? And if it's not working, how do we make it work? I think those are kind of what I feel when I think of this topic, because I don't know if it's working, and that's not good.
So two quick points. So first, do you guys know the term "who gas"? Who gives a shit?
Not.
So who gas? Who gas is like queepy trivia. So red and blue states didn't exist until the election of 2000. Before that, every station and every election, green, purple, like random colors were used. And it wasn't until 2000 that we finally settled on red and blue for the particular parties. And when we're talking about, so red and blue states and states' rights, I think we could also talk about, there's a lot of people in blue states that are like, sure, red states, go secede, go be your own country, because they're looking at, and I'll say something controversial, that's fine, but red states are at the bottom of all of the lists when it comes to education and healthcare and economics and this and that. So the blue states are out there saying, well, obviously the way that blue states are doing it is better because they're all at the top of the list.
I guess I'd look at where that data comes from and at what point that is. Because, I mean, when you tend to look at the maps, when you even have a blue state or a red state, you get down into the specific demographics and not just a statewide label, that changes, right? You look at a map of California, most of the map is actually red, but the high density spots are blue, right?
Land doesn't vote.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, but it's kind of the people. It's like, so again, when you kind of look at that, there's still a representative population that's not necessarily included in that. So, I've always kind of taken the standpoint that statistics are for losers, right? I mean, statistics don't prove anything. We've all taken stats classes, that with the right set of data, you can prove anything, right? So you got to kind of get past that. My question would be with that, it's like, okay, where do those numbers come from? What's the representation? Like, there's a lot more information that'd be needed to say that, a blue state is better than a red state or vice versa.
And that's why, I know that was a controversial statement, and I kind of did that purposely. In my mind, the the strengths and weaknesses of the states like balance each other out. That there are pros and cons to whether you have a more liberal or a more conservative government in your particular state. And, as the United States, as a unified country, we kind of balance all that out. And if you had too much of either one, I think we would find ourselves in more issues than we do today.
So, getting back to what Thea mentioned about, does our current system work and should we change it? I think it's important, hopefully the people listening to this podcast have some knowledge of history, and they know that after the Revolutionary War, we did not go straight into the U.S. Constitution, but we had the Articles of Confederation, and it didn't work very well. And the Articles of Confederation definitely was a lot more like the EU right now, where each state was very much a sovereign, independent state, and it was just a very loose sort of treaty between these individual states that kind of formed the United States, but they were not very united under the Articles of Confederation, and it led to a lot of problems, which led to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. And so I think we can point to that as an example of how, if we shift the pendulum too far to the states having more sovereign rights and the federal government being less powerful, we at least have one historical example of how that doesn't really work very well. And I would imagine that it would be a lot worse today than it was then, just because of the United States role in the world today and international trade and everything that affects that. So then I think the question would be, could we move the pendulum a little bit closer that way without going too far, or should the pendulum move the other way, and should there be more federal control and less states' rights? I know what my answer would be to that, and I guess I'll just say, from the libertarian standpoint, that I looked to see if there was anything about like states' rights versus federal, and really there isn't. But what it comes down to is that the Libertarian Party believes that the individual is the sovereign, right? And government is a necessary evil that allows us all to function together in society. And the smaller and less powerful and more local that government can be, the better. And so I think in that framework, libertarians are probably leaning more towards states' rights than an all-powerful centralized federal government. But coming from a career in the Department of Defense, I can certainly say that we definitely need a centralized government for the common defense. That's in the preamble of the Constitution. I agree with that. And I think, as far as state craftsmanship, right, when we need to present a united front to other countries of the world, we can't have California having one international policy and Texas having a different international policy, although we kind of end up with that with like our border control issues, which I put in my notes as kind of a contemporary issue about like states' rights, where some states are like, hey, I'm a sanctuary state, come on in, we'll take care of you. And other states, typically the ones that are close to the southern border, are like, whoa, hold on, like we can't have all these people crossing.
Let me push back on that, because this is a big misnomer in the state of California. The border at Tijuana or so the border in California is no less secure or more secure than the border in Texas or Arizona. So I always say, when people say it's a border, like they make it a border issue, I don't think that's true. California is a border state. Okay. Like we are a border state as much as Arizona is. I mean, obviously our border isn't as wide as Texas is, but we are a border state. And I don't think that California's attitude is everybody come on in, but our attitude is different when it comes to how people should be treated who seek to come in. And I think so I'm starting to push back on, I guess as a Democrat in the age of Trump 2.0, I'm pushing back on the framing of certain Democratic positions more, because I think because we've allowed a certain framing to happen, it has made the conversation take place on someone else's terms. And I don't think that's been helpful from the Democratic point of view. So that's the only reason I'm pushing back on you a little more. And I think I'm going to do that more because I think we frame these conversations a little bit lopsided or inaccurately. But I hear what you're saying. You know what I mean? But you're right.
So Thea, yeah. I want to say, I think that's a really good input because we do tend, even us here on this podcast, we're going to come at everything with our own biases. And we have our own media that we consume and everything. And you're absolutely right. Like whoever is in the White House, whoever is in Congress, whoever is on the media is going to kind of either consciously or subconsciously push certain terms, certain phrases into the narrative that we're going to use. And so, yeah, absolutely. Like part of the purpose of this podcast is for us to sort of challenge all of that, challenge each other. So appreciate that. Thank you.
So Thea, can you, as a fellow Dem, can you address the way that I see it being discussed is, okay, so Democrats are different about how we would treat people who are trying to cross the border. How would we address people who say, well, if you treat them like crap, they won't want to come, and the fact that you're treating them nicely therefore means you want them to come?
I just think there's a fallacy there. I think all people are entitled to a level of being treated with dignity and respect. And I also think our laws, the problem is like, instead of fixing the system, we want to attack the people who, it's just like, I like when you look at tax law, I know taxes aren't a favorite of a lot of like Dion in particular, but like, instead of closing the loopholes or looking at the way the tax laws are, we're always going after or upset about how people take advantage of those loopholes, right? So instead of looking at our asylum system and saying, is this system correct? Are these laws as they are on the book how we want them to be? We attack the people who seek to utilize those systems, right? And maybe some people have abused the system. And so my solution is not that we treat the people inhumanely who seek to utilize to take advantage or to utilize our systems. We look at our systems and we fix the systems and we figure out better ways to do it, right? Because I don't think, and my other bias is I'm a child of an immigrant, right? And so I see the potential that immigrants bring to this country, and I think we can't treat them all like crap, you know? So yeah, I think the framing is important. And I think that the other thing is like, it hits me like, the fact that we talk once a week at least, you know, and we all four of us live in 4 different states. We are living in different types of communities, but we communicate with each other on a regular basis. It does change our perspective of these issues. And I think it does give us, even though, yes, the thing that, you know, when we talk about like border security, it means something different from me to Brett, to Dion, to you, Will. Well, we all live in the U.S. and we're all kind of trying to come to some kind of consensus and come up with answers. But what I fear with our current system and with this view that states' rights should prevail is that we're going to lose that cohesiveness, right? And you know, Democrats were the party that governs, right? So I think Democrats, based on our policy, seem to favor a stronger federal government. It's ironic now. This is the first time I think in my life where I've really questioned the role of the federal government. I've never really looked at the federal government and said, I don't trust them, or no, I don't think they, and it feels like a role reversal. But it's the first time I truly don't necessarily think that the people running the government have my best interests at heart. And so then I'm like, oh, what does that mean? What does that mean for like how I view the government?
That's 100%. That's I'm on the same page with you that you know, Dems who are normally very pro strong central government, now the roles are reversed. We're like, we could use some states' rights. You know, same thing with, you know, I think I mentioned it previously about the Second Amendment. Like, the longer Trump is in office, the more I'm like, maybe I do need some guns.
See, this is the beautiful revelation that all of us libertarians pray for, is that you are now seeing like, what happens if the power is in these people's hands that we don't agree with? And we're like, what if none of them had that power and you, the individual, had the power?
I mean, I don't trust individuals anymore than I trust I guess the thing is like, okay, I remember, we're all old enough to have lived under several different Democratic and Republican administrations. And I guess I always felt that the administrations agreed with the rule of law and they understood and adhered to the rule of law. Norms are another thing, but at least the rule of law. And I had confidence that there were guardrails. And right now I don't feel like those guardrails, like the rule of law only works if it's enforced, and it's not being enforced right now. So that's like leaves me feeling like, I don't know, maybe all I have is my state government.
So Thea, I would just point out, and I do want to say, I do have some of the same initial like inklings of fears that you do, that we may be finding ourselves in sort of new territory here. But I at least
only inklings,
right. Well, what I at least see is that, like, so far Trump and his administration is going to the courts with things. Like, he has actually brought things to the Supreme Court and said, like, I would like you to rule on this and things like that. So at least on the face of it, that shows that there is an appeal to another co-equal branch of the government right now. So now, if the Supreme Court doesn't rule in his favor and he decides that he wants to do something different, that's a different story. But, like, at least right now I see in the news, it's like, oh, this is being fought in the courts. And so I'm like, okay, the like co-equal branches of government are meant to fight against, like, brush up against each other. And there is meant to be
Yeah,
like
I guess my
friction.
thing
And
is like, but I guess the issue that I'm starting to see is like, for example, the situation where the individuals were sent to El Salvador. I think it's El Salvador, where they were deported to El Salvador without any type of hearing, without any type of due process. The judge that came before a judge, the judge ordered the plane to come back, and that order was ignored. And even in the follow up, the administration has not adhered to the question, the request for information that the judge has had to try to again flush that out. Those examples are hinting at that when the administration doesn't like the rule of law, that there is a defiance there. That I'm nervous for the moment where now the Supreme Court is the court that is ignored. Right. And so,
I
yeah,
agree with you there.
that
Yeah,
has me
that's a
nervous.
good example. I do agree with that.
Yeah. And that's where now it's like, for the first time, it's like, because here's the thing, this happens to me every time I leave California. I go visit some friend, I go to another state, and I go, wow, look at how nice their house is. And they paid what for it? And I'm like, maybe I should move. And then I go, what's keeping me in California? And now I'm like, no, I guess no matter, nothing, I'm not leaving the state, So now I do have a different sense of like, maybe it's a false sense of security that at least, okay, I live in a state where I do feel like my state government aligns with my values and aligns with what I believe in. And I think that's how other people feel about their states. But I've never been that type of person, because I mean, we were in the military. I lived in a bunch of different places, and I never felt like I needed this connection to my state the way I do now.
I feel like even if you take it even one more, the reason why people live in the country versus in the city a lot, in my opinion, is that they are like, well, the values of the city don't mesh with them, therefore they want to live out in the country where it's a little bit different. And then you can look at the difference between a city government versus a county government, even within a single state.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should not underestimate, though, or like, I guess I want to speak to, a lot of times people live where they can earn a living. And so a lot of what brings people into cities are jobs. And sometimes what brings people out of cities is the ability to live at a certain quality of life based on the cost. So I think that it's not always their political views and their values that are driving them in or out of cities, And so, because for me, I would love to live I think I would, I'm at my parents' house and they live in Palm Springs and I'm sitting in their nice backyard and it's quiet. I would love to live out here if I could have a job that pays what I make in LA, but that job doesn't exist in Palm Springs, at least not in my field. So I live in the city,
And that is, I mean, we kind of brushed over it early. People just can't move to whatever state they want to live in. Like, it's just, it's never, it'll never be an option.
Very difficult.
But at least, at least we can be grateful that we live in a country where it is possible, right? There are no legal restrictions against you relocating to a different state. So that's nice. So we kind of brushed on the topic, but we didn't really quite get into it. Do any of us feel like there should be more federal control over this country?
In general, I would say yes. In general, I do think that I think yes.
Even though sometimes this country votes for a majority Republican Senate and House and a Republican in the White House.
Yes, because I don't think, and I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I don't think Trump is reflective of Republican voters as a whole or the Republican Party as a whole long term. Just because the stock market spikes doesn't mean that that's reflective of the market over time. And that's how I see MAGA and Trump. I guess
maybe I should rephrase. We voted for Trump, right?
Yes.
And this time we not only was it an electoral college victory, it was a popular vote victory. So this could happen again. And so even with
Dion, you should probably clarify when you say we, it doesn't mean it's like the royal we, like as a public, not necessarily we four.
Yeah, we as a country. We as a
country.
I guess I still believe in the promise of our republic and what our federal government at its best can do for the people. I believe in that model. And I had, despite everything, I still believe that it's a force for good and can be a force for good. And I think that's true in the future, even if right now it's not.
So what powers would you grant to the federal government that it doesn't have now over the states?
I don't think it's that. I think it's the enforcements I think it's the way that those powers are enforced and upheld. I would continue to do that. I don't think that the federal government necessarily, I guess I am in favor of what people currently criticize as overreach in the federal government, right? I like the social safety net, and I think that the federal government provides a social safety net. So I am okay with, Medicaid and Social Security and those types of benefits. I am in favor of them. I was in favor of a lot of the oversight that you get from DOJ. I was in favor of, the Department of Education, making sure that kids who have special needs are getting funded to have, their needs met in their education. Like all those things I'm in favor of. And I think in order to have those things, you need a strong federal government. And I know a lot of people criticize those things. So I guess that's where I'm in favor of the things that are already in place and keeping those things in place, not to mention national defense and all that.
I mean, my thoughts is more to the states. But I mean, yes, there is things that the federal government should do. And, yes, the 10th Amendment kind of lays that stuff out there. And I think that's a good standpoint, because when you have the ability for the states to have more control over things, again, it's more opportunities. Like I talked about, when we can, spread that out, it's kind of like the laboratories of democracy, so to speak. Like you have the individual states where they can experiment with policies. And we've seen that before, where the states will do that for a time and they eventually get adopted as federal policies because they're good policies, right? And it gives that opportunity to kind of try that stuff out. I mean, we've seen that from child labor laws and, women's suffrages that was enacted in several states before it became federal law. And, kind of a more recent example would be California with their environmental protection laws. A lot of what they had from the automobile emissions was a big one. Well, 2016, the EPA actually adopted that as a federal standard, right? We see that kind of trend going. So it gives more opportunities for those things to be tested out. Now, that also tends to lead where there has to be more time allowed to see whether the policy is good or bad, whether it succeeds or fails. And I think that's the rub, right, that we're talking about, is that unfortunately we live in a society, everybody wants everything now. It's that instant gratification. And I think that works against us in a lot of instances. Like, people aren't willing to let things take time to prove themselves. Right. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but as an example, I like home cooked food way better than fast food. Right. It takes longer, but it tends to be better. Right. It's just kind of how that plays out. So, something is an instant gratification that I get my answer and my satisfaction immediately may not always be the best thing. We might need to let things play out. So my general thoughts is, the federal government shouldn't have additional powers. That's for sure. And people should have more choice.
I think what I have a hard time with, and like, I'm trying to think, well, what shapes my view of, or my distrust of the state? So I think for me, when I was in high school, we moved to South Carolina from California. So I went to high school in South Carolina. And I remember back then, so this would have been late 90s, early 2000s, or literally 2000. But the Confederate flag was still flying over the Capitol back then. And I remember I had to go down to the Capitol to interview for my appointment to the academy. And I remember having to look up and see the Confederate flag as I was walking into this building full of lawmakers. And because where Strom Thurmond and Fritz Hollings, which were the senators, they had their offices right by where the actual Capitol building was in Columbia. And I remember just being like, this state is so far behind. I just, you know what I mean? And this fight was going on, and the things that were being said. And it just made me feel like, thank God, at least the U.S. moved past this, and we're not still stuck in people trying to glorify the Civil War. And that's where I guess that sometimes I struggle with allowing the states to have too much autonomy separate from where the direction that the federal, the country as a whole, is going, because I think sometimes that's a recipe to lack, I guess, for where bad habits or bad things can be allowed to fester, or allowed to go on. And you see the whole, we talked about busing, and we talked about desegregation. We mentioned busing today, but when you talked about desegregating the schools and all of that, I feel like if the South had their way, I would never have really gotten an equal education, or all of these things wouldn't have happened. And a lot of those fights happened under the umbrella of states' rights, right? You shouldn't tell me how we are going to educate our kids, and you shouldn't force us to desegregate our schools, and you shouldn't force us to let Black people have full citizenship in this country. So I guess that's because I grew up with a parent that lived through that era, and that's so much shaped my dad's identity. And when he talks about these things, these are his life story. I guess I'm always in the back of my mind being like, you got to be careful letting the states have their way too much, because sometimes they'll use that power for evil.
Well, and I think that's what the supremacy clause in the Constitution is for, right? Whereas when you have a conflict between state and federal law, the federal law prevails. But this kind of circles back to what we were talking about before, right? Where, there's still carryover from things of a bygone era that just haven't filtered their way out through the system yet, right? But as we've seen, as we talked about earlier, information is more available. We're more connected to the world. People are closer together because of technology and the information that's shared there. And so I think as these experiments continue to go, where we have this democratic laboratory of different areas, you're going to see that kind of stuff rise to the top faster, where people are going to be like, no, that's not okay, because these people over here, they're doing things differently and it's working well. We don't want that here. And you're going to see a shift a lot faster, right? It may not take a generation and a half to get rid of a flag that is representative of a bygone era, right? I think we'll see a faster turn of those things, but you have to give people the chance to do that, rather than simply dictating, no, this is the way it's going to be, and it's the only way it'll be. That it just kind of negates the whole point of the United States. And we just go back to one country. We're just America. And I think that's a sad state when we get to that, because it doesn't give us that opportunity to have those individual freedoms, because we do kind of have that top down. Now, yes, there are going to be disadvantages to the states' rights in that, right? It's always been around uneven protection and services for people, the human rights stuff that we talked about before. The other thing you're going to get is kind of this concept of the race to the bottom, right? Where it has a dark side when you look at innovation. Well, when people start getting lazy and you want the state to take care of things, and it just, that goes a negative route too. Another issue you have with states' rights is that national problems become harder to solve because everybody wants to do things their own way, right? There's always negatives to this stuff. But looking at the broader scale of what's possible, because another one that comes to mind when we talk about disparity among states is, the justice by geography, right? That becomes an issue too. But again, I think as we become more in the light and people have more view of these things, I think that will happen less over time because we'll have more examples that we can point to in a faster time frame.
Well, we've concentrated on a lot of the negatives, starting with the Civil War and slavery and, states' rights in that respect and, segregation and all that kind of stuff. But we should also consider some of the positive things like marijuana use, right? Like I've never used marijuana. I don't like the smell of it. I probably never will use it, but I also don't want to prohibit other people from using it. Right. I think it's something that if you're a grown ass adult and that's what you want to do, to me, it's no different than smoking a cigarette or having a beer. Right. Like you do you. Right. And so I think that's a positive thing. Or look at like Nevada. I have a friend that grew up in Nevada and she said that like the state's college scholarships are almost entirely paid for by the casinos, the taxes on the casinos, right? So something that Nevada was able to experiment with and turn into a success story, right, is something that states' rights allows you to do, right? So there are positives there. Thea, you were talking about how you feel more comfortable in California with their gun laws than maybe you would feel in Texas, right? And that you would view that as a positive. I wouldn't, but that's fine, right? That's why we live in different states. So we can't forget that freedom is scary, right? And so freedom means that you have the freedom to succeed or to fail. In some cases, I think California has done some good things, right? I don't agree with all of the environmental protection things that have come about, but at the core of it, we know that we have limited resources in this country. And if we are not good stewards of those limited resources, we will run out of them and we will end up killing ourselves. Right. So some acknowledgement of how to respectfully manage the resources that we have is a good thing. And I think a lot of that has come out of California. So we shouldn't lose sight of the positive aspects of states' rights that have led to some good things that maybe could be adopted nationwide.
But see, Dion, everything you just mentioned in general, okay. So whether you're talking about marijuana, casinos, like those are things that in general Republicans are against. Conservatives are against gambling and legalizing marijuana. So the things that you're talking about as being positives of states' rights are positives in general for liberals, but not for conservatives. Like it just depends on which side of the aisle you're on and which policy it is you're talking about. Oregon has one of the most, like they have experimented the most with their election systems. They've got such a wide range of 100% vote by mail. Everything that Oregon does with its election system, conservatives in general are saying, well, that's too rife for fraud. We shouldn't be allowing Oregon to be doing that. So it just depends on which side of the aisle you're on and what it is that you're talking about. Nevada, prostitution's legal, right? Like conservatives wouldn't like that. So, I mean, yes, I agree. There are certain things where I do like states' rights, not for the prostitution thing, but for, I don't know, environmental stuff in California, right? But people on the other side of the aisle wouldn't like those things.
Well, and that's why in their state where they have a majority, they vote a different way, right?
Yeah, I think
But if we had a national, if there was like a strong national government that said essentially thou shalt, right? Like, I'm pretty sure the state of Nevada has a a good thriving sex worker um, ecology there. And as far as I understand, I haven't really researched this, but as far as I understand, the workers are well paid. They have health care, and the state makes its taxes off of it, and it's essentially another career field, right? Whether you like it or not, I don't think I haven't seen anything that indicates that it is like this terrible thing that's a blight on the state. So great. They voted for it, and other people don't want it in their state, and that's fine. Don't be a worker, I guess. But
I ironically, I think this conversation has made me look at states' rights a little differently, because I don't think I've ever really talked about it and heard myself talk it through, because I think it's interesting. I've always viewed it as looking at the states that are doing things I don't like and being like, I want the federal government not to allow that to come my way, right? But now I guess I'm looking at it a little bit different, in that, like, the things we're talking about, I'm like, yeah, I'm glad that Nevada gives a data point for gambling, right? And so, because a lot of times the absence of information and the absence of data can make for bad laws, right? So if one state's doing it, we at least get data of what does that happen, what does it look like when this thing is actually legal in this country, and marijuana laws and those types of things. So I guess from that perspective, I appreciate the freedom of the different states to have their own laws and to have to be diversity. What I worry about is, the laws that come and they start to infringe on what I feel are my inalienable rights, right? I am more comfortable having, loose gun laws as long as as a woman, if I am in a position where my health is in danger, I feel like I have the choice to decide whether an abortion would be performed or not. Like, I guess I'm willing to take the trade-off where there's more freedom versus less. And so we'll see. Oh, thank you. So, my dad turned on the lights. So.
I feel like the only time people want states' rights is when they are not getting what they want from the federal government. So,
yeah,
Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. Conservatives weren't getting what they wanted from that outcome. Therefore, conservatives wanted states' rights for abortion. But
I don't know if
same thing with education,
like
with school vouchers.
Yeah.
So it's not,
or they don't like the direction of the federal government.
Yeah, but
you know what I mean.
And that's why I was saying, like, it just depends on what the policy is and who the specific person is, because while conservatives would want states' rights for abortion and education, I'll keep going back to prostitution. Like, no conservatives out there like, you know what, we should have more prostitution in more states, like, I don't know. And I'm using that as an example. It's the same thing on the liberal side. There are, I like states' rights when it comes to marijuana, but not for abortion. I would have preferred we stuck with
what it sounds like to me is that we should have a system that allows the states to experiment, and we should have the supremacy clause, right, where the federal government can come in and be like, okay, that's a grand experiment, state X, but you're really starting to infringe on people's rights, so knock it off.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, which is the status quo, technically.
Okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Okay.
Like, if we've done a thorough examination of the way our government is constructed and we all sit here and go, well, it's not perfect, but it's probably the best we can do, then
I mean, I think that's kind of the answer overall, that our system by design can work better, but it's still a good system. So is that our takeaway? Yeah.
Nice. I think that's a good conclusion. I think hopefully we've hopefully our listeners and viewers will come away with the same idea that it's not perfect, but it works. Hopefully. All right. Let's get into what's been making us happy.
Okay.
And I think, Thea, we'll start with you since we didn't see you last podcast.
Okay, I brought props. So I drive a Jeep Wrangler. And so in Jeep culture, people may give you a duck, like a little rubber ducky, if they like your Jeep. And so I swear, like I've been on a roll like the last like month or so. I've gotten 3 ducks. And the last one I got was Jocelyn, a kid that she goes to school with, saw that I drop her off in the Jeep. And he brought her a ninja duck and told her, hey, this is for your Jeep. And so today I went shopping down in Palm Springs. I went to this little place, and I don't know if it will show up on the camera very well, actually the picture. And I found these little character rubber duckies. Do you see Spock rubber ducky? And then I got Joker rubber ducky. And I think this is the one I'm going to give back to her classmate. Isn't it cute? And so I got a whole collection of ducks to keep in my car so that next time I see a cool Jeep, I can like pass it forward, because really these ducks have been bringing me so much joy. I should have brought the ones that I got, but I got a princess duck. I got a ninja duck. Over the holidays, somebody left a Santa duck on there, because it's not just that they're ducks, they're characters. I have a Batman duck, an actual like Batman. They're the greatest thing. And so that's what's making me happy, is me finding these little ducks that I'm gonna pass on the joy. I love my Jeep, and I love that that's part of Jeep culture. So
nice.
You gotta have something for the Jeep people.
Yeah.
So my vehicle that I had was 17 years old, and tariffs are about to take effect. That prompted me to hurry up and go car shopping. And I pulled out the car and driver reports, and I was looking at it, and Jeeps they're all down at the bottom. Nobody likes them. They break down too much. So if ducks, if whatever does it for you. But no, so my car, 17 years old, it was going to break down any day anyway. And my wife, a couple of years ago, she got an EV Volvo. We've got a level 2 charger at the house for that. And we went ahead and just finished pulling the plug, but, getting rid of gas. So I got an EV Volkswagen. So we are now all EV. But just going out and test driving different cars. And then today I took a trip with my daughter to Blizzard Beach in Orlando. It was the first kind of road trip with the new car. So that's what's been making me happy.
Brett?
Sorry, wife was texting me real quick. So for mine, since we skipped a week, had a little bit going on here around the house. For our listeners, you may not know we skipped a week. I was unfortunately sick last week and wasn't able to record. But in that time frame, my youngest daughter has started walking, sort of. Right. She's doing like the little couple steps. And so it's just fun, being in that phase where she'll take a couple steps and kind of like fall in your arms, and she'll laugh about it. And, then she's always pushing her little Lightning McQueen car around the house, running over everybody's toes. But it's just a blast. I really enjoy this phase. And with us, it's going to be our last kid. And so, until we get to the phase of grandkids, I won't have really that young of a kid around. So it's just been fun watching her go through that.
Nice.
All right. For me, it's we just got back a couple hours before we started recording this, but my son just turned 9, and he wanted to go to Great Wolf Lodge for his birthday. So we went for a few days, and my best friend and his family drove out to meet us. And so three boys, let's see, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And then us parents, and we got one of those suites there, so we all got to hang out together, and just a lot of fun. And my son, he's not much of a risk taker, so he pretty much spent the whole time in the wave pool. which is fine. He did a couple of slides here and there, but that was his happy place, and it's just so much fun to see him laughing and splashing and just having a grand old time with his friends and everything. So, yeah, it was great. It was expensive, but it was fun. We enjoyed it. So all right.
We bribed my daughter to do the straight vertical slide at Great Wolf Lodge. We bribed her with like $5. And then at Blizzard Beach today, we're like, hey, do you want to go on that straight down slide? And she's like, never again. Like she's so angry at us for bribing her. She's traumatized from Great Wolf.
You know what? Speaking of children doing scary things, so at this particular Great Wolf Lodge, they've got one of those like ropes courses, one of those things that's like up above the ground, and it doesn't look like it's that tall, but it's like 10 feet up the lower level, and then the upper level is like another 10 feet up above that, and he started doing it, and he got really scared. He looked down and he was like, "Oh my God," but the lady that was running it, the little safety monitor there, she was like, "Okay, well, I can let you down over here. Do you want to go down?" He's like, "No, I'm gonna do it," and you could like see the terror in his face, but he had this determination of like, no, I'm not going to check it out. I'm going to do this, as terrifying as it is. And he was shaking by the time he got down. But I was like, you know what? I'm really proud of you. Like, being brave is not about not being scared. Being brave is about being scared and doing it anyways. And that was awesome. Really proud of you, kiddo. So yeah. All right. Well, that's our episode for today, and we'll be coming at you next week with something probably controversial. But don't forget to like and subscribe. Help us to keep this podcast going, and hopefully our disagreements are informing your decisions. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Have a good week.